Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On today's episode, I am talking to Randy Nakamura, who was one of my favorite writers in Emigre back in the early 2000s. Randy has worked as a designer, a writer, a teacher, and is currently finishing a PhD in architectural theory and history, actually. In this episode, we talk about his background in discovering design, what he learned from studying architecture theory, the state of current design discourse, and the void left by Emigre magazine, as well as his 2010 essay, The Uselessness of Design Criticism, which is an essay that I really enjoyed and means a lot to me. Randy does not give many interviews and doesn't have much of an online presence, so I'm really honored to have had this time to talk with him and really enjoyed hearing his thoughts on design criticism, which he says is like broadcasting in the blind, and we talk about what that means. And I'm really happy to be able to share his work with people who may not have read him yet or kind of don't know the work that he's done. So let's get into it. Enjoy this conversation with Randy Nakamura. I was thinking about this the last couple days and knowing that I was going to talk to you and kind of thinking about the things I wanted to talk to you about. And I realized that you're kind of an interesting person compared to the other people that I've talked to so far, in that I've read a lot of your writing, but don't actually know anything about you kind of as a person or your background. You don't have a big kind of public persona. And so I was curious if we could just kind of start there with a little bit of your background and kind of how you got started in design.
Yeah, it's a I guess it's an interesting story, although there's a lot of probably leaps or gaps.
There always is.
To kind of go back to like sort of where I started like officially, basically way back in like undergrad and college. I was a biology major at Reed College up in Portland, Oregon.
Oh.
And this has nothing really to do with design. Although I think in a sense it explains kind of like my academic trajectory, even if it's not necessarily specific to design, although it intersects at a lot of points. But I think the thing to say about my undergrad, in a very general way, it was, I think the Reed College is known kind of for, it's basically like a small liberal arts college in the Pacific Northwest. It was, I went there in like the basically early 90s. It seems like that since eon ago. But Portland was pretty much the same way it is today, just at a smaller scale. But Reed specifically was like this. It was known for like they had a very rigorous academic kind of curriculum, almost like you would say, in some ways very sort of traditional. Whereas kind of like everything else in the school was like a complete free for all.
Oh,
so you kind of weird disparity between like this, this almost like literally classics based curriculum for 4 years. On the academic side, and on the flip side, everything else is like completely, kind of by design or by sort of neglect, like just kind of doing whatever the hell you wanted to do.
Yeah.
So it was a very interesting environment, and I think, it had this sort of classic trademarks of like all small colleges where you had like a very low student teacher ratio, and you had basically you were taught by seminars. Yeah, you had like a few big lectures, especially for like intro classes, but it was like a seminar based curriculum.
Yeah.
So that definitely made an impression on me. This has nothing to do with like design or graphic design yet, but I think in that sort of academic kind of lineage.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And going into basically sort of how I teach today, that definitely affected it. But I think a couple of, or at least certainly one kind of moment I remember at Reed was like, I like browsing like a certain section of their kind of periodical area. And one of the, and this is like I was like 19, 20 years old, so I didn't really know anything about anything, but you kind of like gravitate toward things you find interesting. But I remember kind of looking a lot of this, like, this actually fairly well known journal called October, which is kind of like the kind of classic New York art art history theory. It was, I think Rosalind Krauss was a co-founder of October. I mean, it's
Oh,
kind of like,
interesting.
basically, you know, for like sort of the American art history theory establishment,
Huh.
October is
Okay.
kind of publication, and it's written, it's an academic publication, it's peer reviewed, so it's kind of hard to read. But I was endlessly like fascinated with like the
Huh.
what they're writing about, even if I didn't really get most of it.
Yeah.
But it was my kind of sort of my stumbling upon like basically a form of like very formalist, like you know high theory kind of academic art criticism. But
Hmm.
I found it interesting, even if I didn't quite understand what the hell was going on,
Right.
or what the position of all these people were, or what they were actually talking about.
Yeah. That's so weird.
um, but it was kind of a germ of something, and it does kind of carry on, because it's like a lot of my interest in like design art, what have you, criticism, kind of comes from these like periods where I find something just by accident. I mean, I think finding like Emigre was kind of the same way, kind of
Yeah.
a few years later, like the mid late '90s.
Hmm.
It was literally on randomly on some newsstand, basically in a bookstore I was working at. So I mean, it's like
Oh,
these things are
wow.
kind of by chance, but there's also a sense that there's you you know there's a certain sensibility that I know I have that kind
Hmm.
of is guiding you, even if unconsciously.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So it's not like these things are totally by accident, even though they seem completely like random.
Right. Right. Of course.
And I was pretty disenchanted with the biology major, by the end of 4 years, and we actually have to do like a thesis, like an undergraduate thesis to read. So I basically did what they call a library thesis, which involved no laboratory work.
Yeah.
It was almost in a sense a sort of like, I mean, there's no such thing as theoretical biology, but it was like the closest thing I think you could. I mean, it was kind of like that. I mean, I barely remember what the hell I was doing. I mean, I was interested in like viruses,
Yeah.
and the kind of basically the sort of genealogy, or the phylogeny and history of like viruses. So it was
Mm.
kind of like a weird quasi historical project.
Yeah.
I imagine if I actually had been a little, I mean, if I had somehow stumbled upon, like, say, the history of science at that point,
Mm.
or if Reed had maybe, I mean, they probably had something in that area, but if I had figured out that there actually was a way of studying the history of science or something like that at that point, I might have gone down that track.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
I was definitely more interested in the sort of the humanities side of pretty much everything, including the sciences at that
Yeah.
point. It's a good experience to have that kind of sort of practical understanding of like empirical research,
Hmm.
which is still pretty esoteric to most people. I mean, yeah, for reasons that it's not like something you do in like your garage yet. It's
Right.
it's just very it's science literally.
Right.
So you
Right.
have to learn,
Totally.
have a certain body of knowledge, both practical and theoretical.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
undergraduate was like basically the foundation for you to go to grad school in biology. That's
Hmm.
that's what most of the majors in like basic biology did. So I went to grad school in something totally different.
Yeah. So how did that happen, or what was the trigger that made you think? Because you went to grad school for graphic design.
Yeah,
It was for your
yeah,
MFA, right?
yeah, Cal Arts. I mean, so like after I graduated, from Reed, and like it was like 93, 90, yeah, like basically 93. I eventually got a job working at a bookstore for several years. And this was Cody's Books in Berkeley, California. And this is notable purely because that's where I kind of stumbled upon Emigre magazine and like the newsstand at Cody's while I was
Interesting.
working there.
Yeah.
And that was my, accidental, kind of
Yeah.
gateway drug into graphic design, I would say.
Yeah. Interesting.
And that was when it was kind of the era when they went from like the big tabloid size down to
Yep.
kind of the magazine size. So it was they were in the kind of process of scaling down the magazines, like a smaller and smaller
Yeah.
page.
Yeah.
But it was still kind of in its heyday still. They were publishing interesting stuff that it was a combination of like kind of work and like essays, and that kind of interesting kind of blend that they kind of did in that. It was late '90s, so it was kind of the heyday of like magazines in
Right.
general.
Right. Right. So you saw this. So you saw this magazine and just like
Yeah,
basically devoured it and was like,
yeah.
"This is
Basically, I mean, it
interesting."
was one of those things where I basically thought, oh, okay, this is interesting because it's like it looks really interesting, but there's actually interesting content. People are actually writing about design in like interesting ways. So it was like a combination of the two. So it wasn't just like a portfolio kind of, magazine, or like a strict, something like October, which was like all text basically and a few images. It wasn't like a strictly academic thing. So it was kind of this in between kind of mode of like publishing and like criticism that that I found actually both accessible and actually really, interesting. It was something that was, that you could literally pick up and kind of get, I guess, if you were of the right mindset.
Right. And did you know that graphic design was a thing? Were you aware of that as a profession at this time?
Only kind of almost like a subconscious way at that point. But then, when I saw Emigre, I realized, oh, this is actually like a thing you can do.
Yeah, yeah.
That isn't just like, it isn't, because I think if, for most people who don't have a design background or aren't interested in it, it's just like eyewash. All the stuff, once you understand it, like, everything is like design, but then like before that kind of point, it's like background noise.
Yeah, yeah. So when did you start writing about design? Was it when you were at Cal Arts?
Yeah, it was mainly when I was at Cal Arts. So, the Emigre kind of discovery was kind of percolating in the back of my mind. I became more interested in design. I actually took some like basically evening classes through like UC Extension in Berkeley, which is kind of like my sort of first kind of, it was basically like foundational classes. So I took like a couple of type classes, like a graphic design, one class, like literally, and like a color theory class, and they actually had some really good teachers there at the time, which I think actually helped quite a bit, because I got a really good impression about design from the kind of the beginning, and that was just kind of dumb luck, I think.
Yeah.
But so I took a few UC Extension classes, and then Emigre had a very strong association with Cal Arts, so that's how Cal Arts came on my radar, just because of basically all the people who published in there, Jeff Keaty. And I bought a bunch of their back issues, which are now like probably worth ridiculous amounts of money.
Yeah, they are.
At the time you get them for like, $50 or $20 or something like that. It's relatively cheap, but so I basically just kind of bought a good chunk of their back catalog. This is kind of like your sort of like self-education.
Yeah.
But that was kind of my informal introduction, or that's how I kind of found Cal Arts to be interesting, and it was and I basically ended up doing a little bit of like design work for like the place I was working at, just kind of in-house, pretty much very run-of-the-mill, like designing like a catalog, but it's all this kind of stuff that's like just kind of blah. But I figured I was always thinking that, okay, so you can kind of do some stuff, some basic stuff, but this is actually more. This whole kind of discipline is more interesting than just, designing, just crap. There's actually ways of finding critical inquiry or doing things that are, that are more interesting than just kind of like day-to-day kinds of functional, like, publication design. So I basically decided at one point in the early, this is like, I must have been 2001, 2002, to just apply to the program.
Okay.
And their MFA program at Cal Arts in graphic design, and they had, I think at that point they were kind of introducing that 3-year program, because it was usually like a 2-year program, and they kind of expected you to have like professional experience, usually like an undergrad degree.
Okay.
But the 3-year program was actually really, I think I applied to the 2-year program, and they basically they basically decided to kick me down the 3-year program, which in retrospect was, I think, the appropriate choice. Yeah. Because I think I needed that extra year of foundation. I mean, pretty ambiguously. I didn't have a huge problem with it at that point. I don't really know what they were thinking in like letting me into the program, but they apparently saw something in the application. I'm a halfway decent writer, I guess. I mean, I think application essays help, but it's my portfolio was probably okay-ish. I wasn't completely garbage. They saw something, so yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to me, because I think in a lot of ways my introduction to graphic design was very similar to yours, basically 10 years later, where my kind of first awareness that this was a thing was through like Design Observer and Speak Up and all of those. And so I saw it as this kind of not just making stuff that looks cool, but also this kind of critical discourse around it also.
Yeah, totally.
How did that kind of affect your approach kind of going into CalArts, and where did you start kind of writing about this yourself?
I started, I mean, this is kind of a funny story, but I basically, my kind of introduction to kind of like, in a sense, design criticism was, I think this is in my like final year, kind of a thesis year, a third year. And we do this project, which is basically a writing project kind of early on in the year, and like this fall semester. I forget, they had a name for it, and for the life of me, I cannot remember what it was called officially. But I mean, I think the curriculum was much different now, but it was basically, in a sense, writing, it's funny because I wrote this piece that actually was eventually published in Emigre. I think the 67th, it was basically, I wrote this piece for this class. It was a kind of like a prelude to like thesis work. And I turned it in and I got it back, and then the immediate response I got was, and it might have been, I don't know who, I think it might have been Michael Worthington, but he basically said, this is completely wrong, Randy. You didn't do the assignment. And then he said, you really should think about publishing this.
Oh, interesting.
No, I mean, I'm pretty sure it was Michael. I might be misremembering my own past, but I'm pretty sure it was Michael. And he said, this isn't the assignment, Randy, but it's really good and you should think about publishing it. And I'm going like, what?
And this is like the first time you've kind of ever really written anything about design.
I mean, exactly. This is like basically my first ever writing something about basically a kind of design criticism. And it was basically, so at that point I was going, that's the most interesting kind of feedback I've ever gotten in anything ever.
Yeah.
So that actually did eventually lead to Emigre publishing the kind of essay.
Okay.
And that was basically the first thing I published. I think it was published in 2004. It was basically talking about, I don't know if you read this piece, but it was called like the Grand Unified Theory of Design or something.
Yeah. It was of nothing, right? The Grand Unified Theory of nothing. Yeah.
It's like, I wrote this got over almost 15 years ago. So
yeah. I know exactly. That's probably one of the first things of yours I ever read, actually, is that piece.
And it was anthologized in like that Looking Closer 5 or 6 or something like that too. So it got out there.
Oh, that's funny.
It is one of the first things people usually find if they do a Google search, because I think a good chunk of that, one of the anthologies is, or maybe even the issue of Emigre is actually on Google Books in like partial form.
Yeah.
So it's actually pretty easy to find, which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, that all came out of like basically a grad seminar class, kind of like a pre-thesis. I mean, maybe I even wrote that in like maybe the spring of my second year. I can't remember anymore, but it was like published in 2004. That's why I remember at this point.
Okay. And did that kind of like spark something in you? Like, I could.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it gave me an idea that well, I mean, first of all, that someone besides myself thought that my writing was decent,
right.
And also that there is some sort of like need for this, or there's an audience, or at that time, Emigre was kind of the big kind of house disciplinary organ for like graphic design, which obviously doesn't exist anymore. But that at that point, it was kind of it was kind of this kind of clearinghouse for basically graphic design criticism.
Yeah, and now. Are you currently in the critical studies PhD program, or have you what is kind of your status
I mean, there? I'm basically at the I'm basically at the stage where they call ABD all but dissertation, so I'm technically a candidate. So I'm I'm like 80% done. It's just a matter of writing.
And what
you're finished writing the dissertation.
And what made you? So it's a PhD in critical studies.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, and this is like the other kind of sort of jump in my career is like going from like kind of graphic design world to kind of architecture PhD kind of world.
Yeah, that's where I was curious. I wanted to try to figure out where those things came together.
So, I mean, it was kind of I was, I mean. to make a relatively long story short, I mean, so after grad school, I kind of did the kind of standard freelance thing.
Okay.
I actually worked on a couple of projects with Jon Sueda in his
Oh yeah.
office.
Yeah.
But after that, I eventually I got this position at this company called the Grateful Palate, which was this another like interest. Well, actually, it was a very ambitious company at the time, which no longer exists. But the Grateful Palate was interesting because, and it also has a college connection because they basically were an Australian wine importer that decided to go into the business of making their own wine. And their kind of angle on the kind of in the wine industry was actually doing really interesting labels and packaging, and they basically hired a lot of actually really good designers. A few which were actually were basically CalArts people. They actually had Jeff Keedy do actually basically labels for some of their most popular wines. But basically the owner of the company had decided that wine plus like graphic design was a good thing, and like packaging design.
Yeah.
So Keedy was I think one of the first designers to work for them. But they actually ended up basically like contracting a lot of people who had gone to CalArts to do basically design for them. So I basically worked for them as basically an in-house designer for like basically it was over almost 3 years.
Okay.
But this was like basically right kind of ramping up with the financial crisis and the Great Recession. I was actually laid off from them, I think, in late 2009, and it was kind of nice in the sense that I actually could get unemployment basically for a while, which made like making a living like less like of a sort of like 5-alarm emergency.
Right.
So I had a little time to kind of step back and figure out what the hell do I want to actually do next.
Yeah.
Because at that point I was somewhat disenchanted with like the actual practice of graphic design. Like just basically professional practice.
Yeah.
I think for reasons.
Yep.
So I basically took that as an opportunity to say, okay, what the hell should I do next, and what I actually want to do next. So, I was based in LA. I basically stayed in LA after school at CalArts. So I was looking at kind of programs like locally that basically were in critical studies / history that were kind of related to design, and there isn't much. If you look at even if you look broadly, like even nationally, there aren't a lot of programs that directly address, say, design as kind of like or the history or theory. It's often you can take classes in it. There might be, there's stuff like the SVA's program of like they're kind of a design research or like design criticism program.
The DCRIT program.
Really exists that. I think UCLA was interesting because they actually had like a master's in critical studies.
Yeah.
Which is basically what I thought was interesting, and it's basically a critical studies program within the architecture school. It's not like in an art history program.
Oh, interesting.
So in a design program, which is very typical for architecture history. It basically is in the same department of school as the architecture, like the professional architecture school.
Yeah.
So you're part of that kind of. You're part of that department directly, not in art history or like critical studies, which are often like separate departments, but they usually have nothing to do with design or architecture.
Right. Yeah.
So that was interesting to me because it's like you're basically in a sense like studying the history and theory of this discipline, but you're technically in the professional. You're adjacent to the professional program.
Yeah.
Too.
As you were working like after CalArts and before UCLA, were you doing any writing at that time also, or were you kind of solely a practitioner?
I was doing some stuff on and off. I did a piece for Jon Sueda's Task newsletter.
Oh, yeah.
And I did that piece on steampunk for Design Observer.
Right.
Which was one of, I think, probably the most widely disseminated thing that I did, at least based on like the crazy comments that 100+ comments.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting way of getting immediate feedback on your work. But I'm not saying feedback in the sense of people actually reading it and commenting on what you wrote, but also it was more like feedback in a cultural sense of like people are really invested in this concept of steampunk, whatever the hell that is nowadays.
Right.
But it was more of an interesting kind of like the fact that you get 100 plus comments on like a Design Observer post, and most posts get maybe a half dozen at the most.
Yeah.
Kind of indicates that there's something going on here in the culture, and like design is intersecting to it, but I'm kind of like writing as an outsider to like the steampunk kind of subculture. But that was interesting purely because of that sort of this kind of cultural or this kind of intersection of like totally different cultures in a way. So that was it was interesting. I mean, it was in a sense, comments are comments. They don't do anything to you. I mean,
right.
At least back then they didn't really do anything to you. I mean, people can be kind of rude and kind of semi nasty, but it wasn't, just like just a bunch of stuff below the article.
Yeah. So did you while you were practicing as a designer, you were also kind of doing some writing on the side?
Yeah, kind of.
And then now, are you doing any graphic design, or are you kind of solely in the theoretical side? I was
doing a little bit of graphic design on and off. I mean, I was doing the kind of basic design for this kind of literary journal called Palabra for a few years. That kind of stopped. I mean, it was a lot of it's like a time, especially right now, kind of a time constraint thing.
Yeah.
Because it's I mean, especially with the dissertation at this point, or that it's like one of those kinds of thing where there's no deadline, but you feel morally obligated to work on it to some degree every day.
Right.
Because it's such a huge piece of writing also, I think. So a lot of it's like, time and time constraint.
Yeah.
It'd be something to be interested in kind of approaching again in the future, but I have to figure out what that actually means.
Yeah. Well, the reason I ask is because when I originally emailed you to ask about, talking to me for this, and I kind of said, this podcast is about the intersection of kind of criticism and theory and practice. Yeah. And you said something really interesting about like, I don't know if I see my work that way as more of just like one kind of practice and another kind of practice.
Yeah.
And I found that phrase so interesting, and was wondering if you could kind of unpack that a little bit, or the way you think about these two sides of your work.
I think that's, in the sense that, especially in the sense that I'm, now teaching again in a design program at CCA. It was just, and this is kind of or in the sense, the sort of like standard model of professional practice. You generally are, a designer working usually for someone, for a client, either, obviously in a freelance capacity or as, an in-house designer somewhere. So in the sense that, you are basically working for someone else.
Right.
And you're producing this service. You're not, in a sense, you don't have any real ownership over the product or what you're designing, no matter how good or bad it is. So in that sense, okay, that's like the standard design practice. People understand that, you're producing your design, you're making things usually for someone else. You have no control over the content, or you have no ownership over the final product in most cases. Some cases you do, but it's fairly rare still. So that's a standard kind of model of professional practice in probably the most conventional sense, possible.
Yeah.
But that's, you're a designer. You are part of design culture, and you have maybe your influence, and have whatever way you want to kind of like qualify that. But I guess maybe in a broader sense, that this idea of well, what does a practice do? In a weird way, I guess there is no real goal for practice, is there? You can make a goal up for one, but I'm not sure what that is. You can say, okay, design practice is basically enables you to make a living doing design in some fashion, right? But the way I kind of think of it is that, okay, these are all ways of, if you're a professional practitioner in design, you influence people basically with what you make, I guess. At whatever level, if you're working for cultural institutions, if you're working for like some kind of agency, if you're working freelance, what have you. If say you're, if you're basically, functioning as an academic, you have a teaching practice, you're influencing your students in some fashion,
right?
Whether if you're having them say, if you're leading, say, like a seminar course in like, say, history and theory stuff, or if you're like leading, if you're teaching them in the studio, you're influencing them in some way that is often really hard to quantify precisely, or even in a qualitative sense. Like, how are you? You're influencing them in some way. You're giving them like assignments, briefs, projects, readings, but that actual influence is like, well, who knows?
Right.
Or I mean, how much do you take credit for what they do, say after you've taught them, or even the result of like say a studio class. It's tricky because it's like, yeah, you're giving them assignments and they're doing things that they wouldn't want to do probably by themselves, but and you're giving them guidance and feedback and criticism, but like how it actually all comes together, it's kind of it's a little mysterious to me, even in my kind of, relatively limited experience as a teacher.
Yeah. I'm thinking about, you wrote that piece a couple years ago called The Uselessness of Design Criticism.
Oh, yeah.
Which is kind of like a bold title. But I'm curious, what value do you see in kind of having a critical if any, what value do you see in having a critical discourse around graphic design?
I was actually kind of thinking about that question like this morning, before I got on Skype and started talking to you, because it's like it is one of those kind of big picture questions. Like, so why do you write like any kind of criticism,
right?
Design, graphic design, or in any sort of like about any kind of like aspect of culture? Because and I was thinking about and this is kind of my appropriated catchphrase. I think design criticism is like broadcasting in the blind. And this is, broadcasting in the blind is kind of, it's one of these stupid, it's basically comes, I think, from that movie Gravity. It was basically the space junk destroys everything in space.
Right. Yeah. I know what you're talking about.
But I seized upon that term because I actually had to look it up, but all of broadcasting the blind means, it's kind of like this, basically a technical term for basically transmitting on some kind of, radio telecommunications device, basically broadcasting without having any idea of like who's receiving your broadcast or who's receiving the transmission. So you have no idea if anyone's actually receiving the message.
Right.
So broadcasting, design criticism being kind of like a broadcasting the blind kind of like paradigm here or model is, like literally you're putting this stuff out there and you have no idea who's reading it or like what they're getting out of it or if anyone's even reading it at all.
Right.
But that right now, that seems to be a very, at least for me, a kind of, it's a good way of thinking about, well, what is design criticism?
Yeah.
Because I think you are generally literally broadcasting to possibly no one. There's an audience for everything. I mean, even if it's a small audience, but you don't know who that might be or who's read something or who's going to read something. It could, maybe it could, something you write could completely change someone's way of thinking about something. Alternatively, it could be totally meaninless. Have no whatsoever. But you can't control that. I mean, you can control that to some degree, I guess, by like, writing something that gets widely disseminated maybe, but even then there's no guarantee that, if things that get widely disseminated every day are often, crap.
Right. Yeah.
or as the kind of, the popular catchphrase goes now, fake news, or, things that are just not worthy of wide dissemination, but they get out there.
Right.
And they actually have tremendous influence on a lot of things. But you can't entirely control that.
It's interesting that you kind of are making that distinction, though, because I feel like that piece on the uselessness of design criticism is not, what I took away from it was not that you were saying that design discourse is useless, but that design discourse for a kind of general audience who are not designers the way architecture or film has critics. That is actually maybe not as will never happen, maybe.
I think in that piece I was, I think that's a pretty good reading because I basically was saying that it's, in the sort of general purpose sense, design criticism is kind of a niche, has a kind of a niche audience. It's not, there probably are exceptions to that, but, you don't have, most daily newspapers that still exist do employ some kind of art critic and movie critic, and maybe if you're lucky, an architecture critic somewhere in there. But, design is not considered worthy of even, maybe they'll reprint something that someone else published, but it's not considered worthy of even like, like a kind of like a, a part-time staff position. It's not considered that important, or maybe it's in a sense so such a huge field in a sense that they have there's no way some one person could cover it, right? So I think I was also trying to like, because I was writing about experimental jet set in a fairly critical way. But I was also trying to make a point about the kind of the actual relevance of criticism to that people who are actually in the profession or the discipline, and which I think at that point I was kind of questioning whether there actually people thought there was any use for it at all.
Right.
Because in a sense, if I remember what I was saying, basically about experimental jet set, that their efforts to preempt criticism were kind of creating this kind of like, well, there is no, basically there are, if in essence as a designer you're saying you're beyond criticism, or that any criticism of you is somehow like a veiled personal attack or an ad hominem attack, then basically you're saying you don't really do any. I mean, you're basically saying that there's no discursive space to your discipline. Therefore, it's like, what's the point? There's, people can make stuff. It can look good or bad, but it's like, but there's no real discussion of it after that. There's any kind of like serious kind of inquiry or like thinking about what the hell graphic design is in say 2017.
Yeah. I mean, that leads perfectly into what my next question for you was going to be is what are, and this is something that I think I've asked everybody that I've talked to, what are kind of topics or issues or things in the design profession that you think need a critical lens kind of turned to them or are not being discussed enough? Or what are the things in the design discourse that kind of designers should be talking about and thinking about?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things. Like I could come up with like a laundry list probably. I mean, I guess I kind of have maybe 2 points of view here, I guess, to kind of distill it down somewhat. I mean, I think you, if I remember correctly, I think you interviewed someone who was like a technology critic,
Sarah Watson.
That's right, and I think I listened to part of that podcast also, not the whole thing, unfortunately, but I'll probably finish it later, I imagine, because it was kind of interesting.
I was proud of that one.
No, that actually was a really interesting person, I think, to interview in the context of like design or graphic design. But that kind of underlines my this point is that just designers in general don't. Designers are very adept at using technologies of all kinds, and people, generally, I think designers, both by nature and just by their education, are incentivized to like approach technology with a very kind of open mind, and they want to learn everything. Because the tools are, nowadays are relatively easy to use across a whole range of media. So that that in a sense gives designers a kind of plasticity of like, both of what they can do and what they can think of doing. But there's very little writing, even in architecture to a large degree, there's very little writing, there's very little writing that considers technology, critically from like a design point of view, of like, say, we understand, there's all kinds of people who, in the media who write like, say, basically reviews of software, of hardware, of gadgets, basically, a kind of functional consumer kind of way, but there's very little understanding or kind of critical assessment of like technology from, say, a design standpoint. I mean, there is, there is in a broad sense. I mean, there's lots of stuff in media theory that I think is very relevant to like designing, even for design. But it's still like a push to kind of bring these two things together. But it's even just like understanding the kind of basic history of the tools designers use. I mean, where are you going to learn that unless you go out of your way yourself to teach it, to teach you that, and especially in the context of like teaching, a grad program. I mean, designers should understand at least the kind of basic, kind of history or sort of understanding of like, what are all the tools you're using? Where do they come from? And like, why do they exist? It's a really interesting history, and but there's not a lot. There's stuff out there, but you have to kind of like cobble it together. Still, there's no big book on like, say, like the history of technology from a design standpoint.
That's really interesting.
Even in architecture. I mean, architecture has a little bit better kinds of, there's more people writing in architecture about things that are adjacent to this, but it's still like one of those things. Well, I mean, if you wanted to like have your students like critically look at like say Photoshop, where do you go?
Yeah.
You have to cobble a bunch of different things together from like dozens of different sources. A little bit of history of technology, a little bit of media theory. There's some stuff, a little bit of stuff in design here and there, but it's like this. It's like, well, yeah, it's like these basic things that we use every day. No one understands them really.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
I'm exaggerating it, but it's not. I mean, it's kind of true. It's like, where's the big book on Photoshop from like a sort of, in a sense, like historical / design theory review. There is none.
No one has given me that answer before to that question, and I have never thought about that before. But that, I feel like you're exactly right. That's so interesting.
The second point I would make here is, and this is kind of like something totally opposite. Is I think, and this is like a broad kind of generalization. And this is somewhat based off of like working with like students this semester and kind of their thesis projects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kind of just in a broad sense, I think there is a renewed consideration of what, say, like, as say like a graphic designer, what does a graphic designer do in 2017 as a graphic designer?
Yeah.
Because graphic designers are kind of, it's like, okay, so, I mean, print isn't really dead, but if you want to make your living as a print designer purely, your opportunities are becoming probably more limited. It's everything is basically becoming, or is in a sense, digital already to some degree, and design is kind of following that kind of path, away from say, or less print and more like screen.
Right.
So and it's the sort of bar for like just production of like things that we consider graphic design is so low now. Mm-hmm. Anyone can print a book, anyone can print a magazine, anyone can print a newspaper for relatively, like, really cheaply, for like under $100.
Yeah.
So like tools have been, as they say, democratized. So what is it that a graphic designer does right now? How do you define yourself as a designer, or how do you define the discipline? Because anyone can do this stuff. I mean, the quality, not anyone can, just because you have the tools doesn't mean you're a designer, but the tools are there. Mm-hmm. Even if someone has no experience, they can kind of do something serviceable.
Yeah. I literally was writing about that today, and something that I'm working on related to this thesis of kind of just questioning, what does it mean to be a graphic designer in 2017 when all the tools that we use, everybody can have them, and there are websites like Squarespace where someone can make a really good looking website in like 2 hours.
It's basically all templates, but they're good templates. I mean, you can get a decent looking, in a sense, the average level has gone up because the defaults have gotten better over time.
Right.
It doesn't mean people are better designers. It just means that like the default templates are a lot better than they were like 10 years ago.
Yeah. Something I found myself saying a lot, as I've been kind of talking to people for this, is that it almost feels like every kind of generation of designers has to redefine what graphic design is for their generation.
Yeah.
And you have to have a kind of knowledge of history and kind of understand where we're coming from and the kind of historical trajectory that we're entering ourselves into. But, can we really keep kind of like, and this is not against Paul Rand at all, but do we still look to him as this is how you make a logo, like this is the best logo, when the worlds that we're designing for are completely different now?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, even his UPS logo, the little box and string. I mean, that's history, because it just doesn't really work anymore. Yeah. At least UPS doesn't consider it kind of emblematic of their company or what they do as what Brown does now, basically.
Yeah.
So much for the sort of every kind of design has like a shelf date to some degree, whether we want it to admit it or not. It'll be historically important, the kind of UPS logo, but it's not going to be in use anymore, or hasn't been for like years at this point.
Right. Being in an architecture program, And in a critical studies program, in an architecture program, which you're exactly right, is so interesting. Has that changed how you think about graphic design, or have you seen the things that you're kind of writing about and studying make its way back into stuff you did as a graphic designer?
I think definitely yes. I mean, it's because, I mean, it's, I mean, and I would actually kind of think about this in the sort of like, you know, even though this is kind of an unpopular thing to say, there is still kind of a hierarchy of kind of design disciplines.
Yeah.
And architecture is, historically speaking, at least, the kind of master discipline in design, for better or for worse. But I think it's been very valuable to kind of have both the kind of training and kind of access to kind of, architecture discourse, both and kind of seeing how people are taught in architecture school.
Yeah.
But also in the sort of critical study sense of like how architecture describes itself in a sense, in a kind of, disciplinary sense. If in the kind of big picture sense, I have this kind of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, project maybe, but only in the kind of vaguest way possible in a sense. At least the way, at least in the sense that I don't want to, I'm still wrapping my head around a lot of these ideas, but it is interesting to see a lot of the kind of parallels that I think have developed between, say, like something like graphic designers are interested in and like what architects are interested in. Because in architecture there's always architects draw. That's kind of one of the distinctive, foundational skills at the very least, that architects learn, and that drawing itself is this huge kind of discourse. Both the drawing itself and like talking about the drawing, but things like that. When you're talking about drawing, that it's a graphic representation, usually on paper, at least traditionally, even still on paper. Yeah, and there's a lot of intersections at that level with, say, certainly ideas in graphic design and architecture that are very, very similar, or maybe have similar areas of influence, or even that were influenced by each other. So that's always kind of fascinating, because there is if you ask a graphic designer to talk about drawing, they're going to give you a completely different answer than, say, like an architecture student or a person. Even though there are a lot of similarities of how, say, designers think about, say, 2D and 3D space. But it's kind of an area where there's not a lot of crosstalk, even though I think there should be. Yeah. I've often thought that like architects and like type designers would have really interesting conversations, because type designers are basically the graphic designers who draw. Right. And architects draw. So I always thought that would be an interesting way of like trying to get kind of people who are actually doing very similar things but in very different disciplines to kind of talk to each other. Even if, like, in a sense, type designers are working at kind of the millimeters in scale, and architects work at like thousands of meters in scale potentially, right? So, but I think there's, especially in like the recent past 20 or 30 years, there's a lot of interesting kind of parallels. Possibly lurking there.
And I've used architecture criticism and architecture theory and architecture and the general architecture discourse as kind of my comparison to graphic design. And a lot of the ways I've been thinking about this, and that architecture always has had this kind of rich kind of discourse around it. Do you think graphic design can have something like that?
Well, I would say that, I think, in a lot of ways, because of the history and because of the ways architects are educated, that they're kind of given license to talk about what they do in like a lot of different levels, both from the sort of high theory to kind of, the sort of like, kind of like the operational lore, kind of talking to other architects, and then kind of like even sort of broader, sort of more popular, popular context. Not a lot of architects actually write for like a mass audience. that I can think of off the top of my head. But I mean, they're given license to like talk about what they do at all these different kind of cultural levels, and I think graphic designers should absolutely have that same license, even if they're basically not given it.
That's interesting,
especially in graphic design. I mean, I'm actually not sure why that is. I mean, if I actually think about it, it's like I don't know where that occurs or why graphic designers don't seem to be as, say, like aggressive and like sort of defining a discourse about themselves. Yeah. Because there's stuff there. I mean, in a sense, graphic designers have as much influence as any, as architects over kind of everyday life,
right?
Maybe in sort of more ephemeral ways, but it's in the set, it's kind of overwhelming how much everything has something on it, every surface.
Yeah.
Whether it be a screen surface or printed surface, it's like it's all designed by someone, even if it's like badly designed.
Yeah. When I talked to Michael Rock, he said we can't escape the aspects of design anymore.
Yeah.
No matter where we go, we are surrounded by design all the time.
I can't remember the names of anything right now. I don't know why, but architects will. I think recently in Chicago, I think it was the Grant Foundation, there basically was like this kind of big event. And it basically was, all these kind of, they all basically produces these publications. And it was, it was about the writing, so each person, basically wrote a short book.
Interesting.
Basically about the sort of discourse of architecture, for people who are emerging practitioners,
right.
What they're interested in, what they thought architecture should be or do, say right now. You mean the equivalent of that in graphic design? The graphic designer would be designing the books, but they wouldn't have any, but it would be less about the sort of discourse.
Mm-hmm.
It would be less about them influencing discourse of graphic design, but them in a sense having the opportunity to design someone else's content.
Right.
So I mean, designers have done similar things, but their contribution is often at the sort of level of designing for someone else as opposed to actually producing the content.
Right.
And there probably is some exception somewhere. But when it comes to books, graphic designers design them. They don't write them.
Yeah.
Whereas architects can pretty much, they can write them and they can even design them, even if they don't design them very well.
Yeah.
But the idea is that they have a license to basically be considered, in a sense, authors.
Yeah.
Whereas graphic designers have to make a humongous leap in order to consider themselves some kind of author or producer, say, of content or ideas or discourse, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of it in a nutshell. I mean, and it doesn't have to be that way, but it is.
Yeah.
And I'm always... And maybe in a sense to kind of refer back to Emigre, it's like Emigre was kind of that license.
Yeah.
To basically that in a sense authorize graphic designers to like talk about themselves,
right,
in interesting, provocative ways. And Emigre doesn't exist anymore, and there is no real replacement.
Yeah. That was
everyone that I've ever that had any kind of contact with Emigre, kind of bemoans this lack of like. There's a huge piece missing here, but no one really knows how to like kind of replace it.
Yeah, and it's like what we were just talking about, where almost the world or the design climate is so different now that what would that thing look like in 2017? It probably wouldn't. And when I say look like, I don't mean just aesthetically, but
Mm-hmm.
kind of distribution and everything. And it's interesting to even think about with social media and everything, is how do you even have a kind of central discourse or central platform that encourages designers to talk about these things? No, I mean, it's both a need for something to have this kind of function, but also kind of they have to recognize, say, mm-hmm.
a publication, whether it be online or say printed, that this is kind of where you go for this kind of discussion, right?
Right.
And kind of generating that kind of momentum and kind of audience is really hard.
Yeah.
And usually expensive, at least certainly at the very least in time. You have to like build an audience and have people understand that this is where you can go to like read stuff like this, right?
Right. Yeah, I know I said that was my last question. I have one more kind of quick question.
Yeah.
Who are the writers or designers or critics kind of working today that you think are kind of doing the most interesting work or uncovering the kind of interesting things right now? Or is there anybody that you're kind of gravitating towards?
God, there are a lot of interesting people out there right now. I mean, trying to think of, well, I mean, one person that I've been teaching a lot of my kind of, basically my seminar classes at UCLA is Alexander Galloway, and he's basically kind of he's a media theory person. So he writes a lot about interfaces. And I have my students read basically like a chapter or two from his book called the Interface Effect.
Oh, I've heard of that.
He writes really, I mean, he is writing in a very kind of academic, somewhat jargony kind of like, relatively high theory kind of way, but he a lot of what he talks about is actually very accessible. So he's difficult on one side, but then I think students kind of do grasp the kind of visual examples he uses.
Yeah.
But he does a lot of really interesting foundational kind of thinking about like what interfaces do in kind of based in contemporary media culture and how they kind of operate, or how the sort of politics of the interface operate. Yeah. Even if things you don't think of like these kinds of visual kind of formal apparatus or devices as having a kind of politics, kind of unpacks all that in a kind of an interesting way. And I think it's useful for students. I mean, he's difficult, but he's good for students to kind of grapple with. He's not technically, writing about design, and he comes from like this very, this kind of continental kind of like philosophical and media theory kind of background. But he's useful because he does look at things that we think are straightforward and intuitive and make them like a lot more complicated. Which I think is good for students to think about, even if he's a tough read, but I think he's useful. I'm trying to think of something a little more design related specifically. I mean, in a historical sense, I mean, this is kind of me being a little more academic, but I mean, if the work of Felicity Scott, and she's mainly an architecture historian.
Yeah, I don't know.
And she kind of writes about kind of the period of like the late 60s and 70s. Is basically the focus of a lot of her work. But she writes a lot of, she's writing primarily about architects, but in that kind of period, that's kind of when pretty much all the disciplinary boundaries began to kind of like maybe not disappear, kind of like become less important.
Right.
But she kind of writes about that whole milieu of like the early mid 70s. Primarily from like an architectural point of view, but the fact that like architects were using the medium of video extensively,
right?
70s, is an interesting, she's kind of like writing about the kind of last historical period, that's far enough away from us, that we think of like that period as now being basically part of history as opposed to like something that's contemporary, I would say. But but she's interesting because she kind of provides that kind of historical perspective on recent history, let's say. And that that is a little more academic. I don't know if I mean, there might be some designers interested in that kind of writing, but it is a little
no, I think that's great.
I always think of it, it's totally relevant, but then also it's also hard, because she has a very clear kind of historical project and kind of like a a certain way, way that she thinks about these things that are not, they're not quote unquote useful to practitioners, but I think they're important.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, those are kind of the two things that stand out in my mind right now.
Perfect. Yeah. No,
I'm sure like 5 minutes over, I'll think of a third thing that would be even more interesting to me. But yeah. Like...
Well, send them over. I can put them in the notes. When I post this, and I thought this was great. Thank you so much for talking to me. I found this so interesting. And
well, thanks, Jared, for interviewing me. Yeah, this is my first kind of official interview, I think.
Oh, nice. Well, great. Now I love it. This episode was recorded on February 24th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.